He thought it was just the aftermath of the storm, an ordinary sinkhole in front of his house. But when he went down inside, he saw something that sent chills down his spine. Subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The night the storm came to the quiet outskirts of Monroe County, it did not feel like any ordinary storm. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension before the first drop of rain fell, and the sky, usually a dull orange haze from the nearby town lights, turned an uncanny greenish gray. Jacob Wilson stood on the porch of his single-story farmhouse, watching the horizon vanish into a wall of darkness. The old oak tree near the road bent as though bowing to something immense and unseen. The radio in the kitchen crackled with warnings about high winds, flooding, and unusual seismic activity, a phrase that sounded more like a government formality than a real danger. Jacob was a man who did not scare easily, but as the thunder rolled low and long over the fields, he felt something in his chest that wasn't fear so much as an ancient unease, an instinct whispering that the earth itself was restless. Inside the house, his wife, Carla, was putting the children to bed. Their son, Malcolm, 13, tried to act brave, pretending to ignore the howling wind as he tucked in his little sister, Lily, who clung to her worn teddy bear. The walls trembled from each gust. Carla called to Jacob through the noise, telling him to come inside, that the shutters were already secure. But Jacob couldn't take his eyes off the fields. Rain began in heavy, slanted sheets, drumming on the tin roof like 1,000 impatient fists. It blurred everything beyond the porch into a single moving curtain. Somewhere in the distance, a transformer exploded with a flash of blue-white light, and the neighborhood sank into near-total darkness. Jacob checked the time by his wristwatch. Midnight. He stayed on the porch another few minutes, feeling the boards tremble faintly beneath his boots. The storm was strong, yes, but there was something else. The sound that followed the thunder was not the crack of splitting wood or flying debris. It was a deep, subterranean groan, like the earth was turning in its sleep. He felt it in his knees, in the soles of his feet. Carla appeared in the doorway, her nightgown clinging to her legs from the humid air. "Jacob, come in now," she said, her voice a mixture of irritation and worry. He turned to her, nodded once, and stepped back into the dim yellow light of the living room. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The only light came from the faint glow of his flashlight, standing upright on the kitchen table. The children were asleep on the couch now, curled together beneath a quilt. Carla sat beside them, her face pale in the beam. Outside, the rain roared like the ocean. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the wind fell away, leaving behind an eerie silence. Jacob could hear each raindrop now, individual, deliberate, and the faraway croak of frogs emerging after the storm. For a moment, he allowed himself to think it was over. At dawn, a faint mist hung over the soaked fields. The air smelled of wet earth and something else, something metallic, as if lightning had melted the soil itself. Jacob stepped outside, the grass squelching under his boots. The sky was washed clean, pale blue with streaks of white cloud. Across the yard, the world seemed calm again, until he saw it. Near the edge of his property, where the gravel driveway curved toward the road, the ground had collapsed inward, forming a massive circular pit. It looked like the earth had simply given up and swallowed itself. The edges were uneven, still crumbling softly in places, and a faint shimmer of rising vapor made the air above it tremble. Jacob froze. The hole was wider than his truck and easily 3 times as deep as a man. He walked closer, careful with each step. The closer he got, the stranger it seemed. It wasn't just a natural sinkhole caused by water erosion. He could see fragments of concrete jutting from one side, twisted pieces of rebar catching the light. The bottom wasn't visible. The shadows inside were too dense. When he leaned closer, a warm draft rose to meet him, carrying with it a faint humming sound. It was subtle, almost like the low vibration of an old refrigerator motor, but unmistakably artificial. He crouched and placed his hand near the edge. The soil was warm after a cold night of rain. "Jacob?" Carla's voice came from behind him. He turned to see her standing by the porch steps, one hand shading her eyes from the sun. "What is it?" she called. He gestured for her to stay back. She frowned, took a step forward, then stopped when she saw the size of the hole. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered. The children, drawn by curiosity, appeared behind her, still in pajamas. Jacob raised his voice, telling them to stay by the porch. "Don't come closer." Within half an hour, a few neighbors began to arrive. The sound of the collapse must have woken half the street. Marcus Dean, a young mechanic who lived 2 houses down, pulled up in his pickup and whistled when he saw it. "Never seen anything like that," he said, shaking his head. Old Mr. Lawrence, who had lived in the area since the 50s, muttered that the ground here had always been strange, though he couldn't say why. Everyone had theories: stormwater erosion, a burst pipeline, maybe even an old well giving way, but Jacob said nothing. He just kept looking at those pieces of concrete half buried in the dirt, their smoothness too deliberate to be natural. As the morning went on, more people gathered. Some took pictures with their phones. Others stood quietly, uneasy. Carla called the local authorities, who promised to send someone as soon as possible. Jacob knew what that meant. Maybe a few days. It was Sunday after all, and half the county was still dealing with fallen trees and power lines. He tried calling the county engineer's office himself, but the line only played a recorded message about storm response prioritization. By late afternoon, the crowd thinned. Only Marcus stayed, helping Jacob mark the perimeter with wooden stakes and yellow rope. The smell near the hole grew stronger as the day warmed. A faint chemical odor, not unpleasant but unnatural, something between oil and metal. Marcus sniffed the air. "That doesn't smell like dirt," he said. Jacob nodded. "It smells like something buried." That evening, after everyone had gone home, Jacob sat on the porch again. The setting sun burned orange through the thinning clouds, casting long shadows over the lawn. The hole was now just a dark circle at the edge of his vision, silent, waiting. Carla brought him coffee, though he barely touched it. She sat beside him in silence, her hands folded in her lap. "You're thinking about going down there, aren't you?" she said quietly. He didn't answer right away. "It's our land," he finally said. "If something under there's breaking the ground apart, I need to know what it is." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes full of worry. "Promise me you won't do anything tonight," she said. "Wait until morning." He nodded, though he wasn't sure he meant it. Night came early and cold. The storm had left the air unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that amplifies every sound. The frogs had stopped croaking, and even the crickets were silent. Jacob couldn't sleep. Around midnight he rose quietly, careful not to wake Carla or the kids, and stepped outside. The moon was hidden behind clouds, but he could see the faint outline of the yard. The hole looked different in the dark, not like a wound in the ground, but like an open mouth, breathing. He walked toward it slowly, flashlight in hand. When he reached the edge, the beam disappeared almost instantly into the void. Then he heard it, the same low hum from earlier, steady and rhythmic. He knelt, holding his breath. It was unmistakable now, a mechanical vibration coming from deep below. For a fleeting second, he thought it might be a generator, maybe some forgotten installation. But who would build something like that here, under farmland miles from any industrial site? He aimed the flashlight along the walls and noticed again the patches of concrete, but this time he saw what looked like faded markings, painted symbols or letters almost erased by time. He leaned farther, trying to make them out. The edge crumbled slightly under his weight, sending a few pebbles skittering down into the abyss. The sound they made when they hit bottom came several seconds later, echoing like the hollow interior of a cavern. Jacob stepped back, heart pounding. He realized this wasn't just a collapse. The ground hadn't simply eroded, something below had given way, something built, sealed, and long forgotten. The idea chilled him more than the wind ever could. He turned off the flashlight and stood there, listening. The hum grew fainter but never stopped. Beneath the soil, something was still alive. He stayed there for several minutes, watching the mist rise from the hole and swirl in the cold air. Somewhere, far off, thunder rumbled again, though the sky was clear. He could feel the vibration in his boots, faint but real. Finally, he whispered to himself, "This isn't over." When he returned to the house, Carla was standing by the window, awake. She didn't ask where he'd been. She could tell from his face that he had already made a decision. The storm might have passed, but something far older and more dangerous had been awakened beneath their land. And Jacob Wilson, for all his caution, knew deep inside that he would not be able to leave that mystery buried. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the fields again, he watched the shadows retreat from the pit and saw, for just a second, a glint of something metallic deep below, like sunlight reflecting off a piece of machinery. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by darkness. Jacob's pulse quickened. The storm had opened the earth, and now it was calling him to follow. He turned away at last, knowing that by nightfall he would go down there himself. The wind carried a faint scent of rain again, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then fell silent. The world held its breath. The hole waited, patient and quiet, as though it knew he was coming. By morning, the air had turned heavy again, though the sky was cloudless. The storm had passed 2 days earlier, yet the atmosphere clung to the land with the weight of something unfinished. The sinkhole no longer looked like an accident of nature. It had become a gaping wound, raw and accusing. Jacob stood beside it with his arms crossed, staring into the darkness below, as if waiting for it to reveal its secret. He hadn't slept much since that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard that low hum from the depths, that strange vibration that no one else seemed to notice. Carla watched him from the kitchen window while making coffee. She had given up trying to dissuade him. The way he moved now, the quiet deliberation, the fixed stare, told her that something inside him had shifted. He was no longer merely curious. He was compelled. She brought the mug out to him and placed it on the hood of his truck without saying a word. The children were still asleep, and for once she was grateful. They didn't need to see the hole again. Jacob crouched at the edge, examining the walls where the concrete jutted out in odd, unnatural shapes. It was clear to him now that part of the structure had been deliberately built, perhaps as a foundation or something deeper. But for what? He had lived on this land most of his life. His father had farmed it before him, and his grandfather before that. None of them had ever mentioned anything buried below. The thought that all these years they had been walking above something man-made, something hidden, sent a shiver through him. When he finally spoke, it was to himself. If the ground's collapsing, it'll take the road next. Maybe the neighbor's property too. It wasn't curiosity, he told himself. It was responsibility. He had to know what was under there, if only to protect his family. He went to the shed and began gathering supplies. An old climbing rope from his younger days, a heavy-duty flashlight, gloves, and a pair of thick work boots. The air inside the shed smelled of oil and rust, familiar and grounding. He found his father's military rucksack in the corner and filled it with essentials: water, a folding knife, a few markers to mark his way. When Marcus arrived an hour later, Jacob was already testing the rope against the rear hitch of his pickup truck. "You're not going down there," Marcus said at once, though his tone carried more disbelief than authority. "Somebody has to," Jacob replied. "It's my land, and if the rest of this starts to fall in, I need to know what's causing it." "Man, that thing could cave in on you," Marcus said, looking at the edges of the hole. "It's not safe." Jacob glanced at him. "Neither is letting it spread." The younger man sighed, then walked back to his truck and pulled out a harness from his toolbox. "At least use this," he said, handing it over. "It's from my climbing days. You fall, it might save you." Jacob accepted it with a nod. "You mind staying up here and keeping tension on the rope?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "You got it. But if that ground starts moving again, I'm hauling you up whether you like it or not." They shook hands without another word. Carla came out briefly, her face pale, holding Jacob's jacket. "At least wear this," she said softly. "It's colder down there." He saw the fear in her eyes and tried to smile. "I'll just look around," he said, though he knew it was a lie. He felt as though something down there was waiting for him, and if he didn't face it now, he never would. He stepped to the edge, tested the rope once more, then began his descent. The earth was damp and loose near the top, crumbling under his boots. Every few feet, he drove a metal spike into the side to hold the line steady. The smell of soil and wet stone filled his lungs. As he went lower, the air grew warmer. He paused and aimed the flashlight downward. The beam caught the glint of metal deep below, something flat and reflective. When he reached the halfway point, he realized the hole wasn't as natural as it seemed. The sides were lined with compacted earth only in some places. In others, smooth surfaces of concrete and rusted steel formed irregular patches, as though an old structure had been swallowed by the ground long ago. He ran his hand along one of the slabs and felt grooves etched into it. Letters, almost erased by time. The paint was faded, but he could make out the remnants of stenciled text. "Section C, authorized personnel." The words froze him. Section C. The designation sounded military, official. He played the beam of light along the surface again and found the ghost of a faded insignia, a star surrounded by a circle. He had seen it before in old photos of his grandfather's service days. The rope creaked above him as Marcus adjusted his grip, calling down, "You good, man?" Jacob didn't answer right away. "I'm fine," he finally said, "almost at the bottom." The ground beneath his boots leveled out sooner than he expected. The beam revealed a rough floor of broken concrete and mud. The air here was thick with the scent of rust and oil, and somewhere nearby water dripped steadily. Jacob turned slowly in place, illuminating his surroundings. The sinkhole had torn through the ceiling of a long, narrow passage. A section of wall had collapsed, leaving a jagged hole just large enough for a man to squeeze through. The passage beyond was dark, but the faint hum he had heard before was louder here, pulsing in rhythm with a distant mechanical beat. He crouched and crawled through the gap. On the other side, the space widened into a corridor lined with metal conduits and pipes. The walls were still intact, though damp and streaked with mineral stains. It looked like a service tunnel, the kind used in old government facilities to move equipment or vent air. The hum seemed to come from somewhere ahead, deeper in. Jacob walked cautiously, his boots squelching in the mud. The flashlight beam caught shapes on the walls, rusted signs, broken fixtures, and in one place, a long crack running the entire length of the corridor. He touched it lightly. Warm air leaked through, faint but steady. Beneath the warmth was another smell, chemical and faintly sweet, like burnt plastic. He passed what looked like an old electrical panel, and its switches fused in place by corrosion. Some of the labels were still legible: ventilation, power grid, test chamber A. He stared at the last one, a test chamber. That was no storm drain or utility tunnel. This place had been built for a purpose, and whatever that purpose was, it had been kept hidden under his family's land for decades. As he continued deeper, the floor dipped and the walls narrowed. The hum grew stronger, but now it was accompanied by another sound, a slow, rhythmic dripping, like water falling into metal. The light revealed a heavy steel door on the left side, half buried by a cave-in. The paint on it had peeled away, revealing a layer of dull gray metal beneath. Faded yellow letters read, "Caution, restricted area." A small inspection window near the top was shattered, and through it Jacob could see darkness and the faint reflection of his own light. He hesitated. The sensible part of him said to turn back, to climb out and wait for professionals. But something about that door held him. He stepped closer, peered inside, and saw what looked like shelving or racks, the shapes obscured by dust and debris. He leaned against the frame and felt a gust of warmer air rush out. The smell of rust intensified, mixed with something else, old oil, perhaps, or decayed chemicals. He pulled back and wiped his face with his sleeve. "Jacob!" Marcus's voice echoed faintly from above. "You still there?" "Still here," Jacob shouted back, though the words barely carried. "Found some kind of structure. Looks old. Real old." He waited for a response, but only faint wind came through the opening above. The connection to the surface already felt tenuous, as though the world above had receded into another life. He turned back to the corridor. The hum was louder now, unmistakably mechanical, but it pulsed irregularly, as if coming from a machine on its last breath. He followed it until he reached a larger chamber, circular and half-flooded. The flashlight beam shimmered across the thin layer of water covering the floor. In the center stood a rusted column of pipes and valves, many broken or bent. A few of the valves still bore faded tags marked with serial numbers. On one of them, barely visible beneath grime, was another label: Deep Soil Initiative. The words sent a strange chill through him. He didn't know why, but the phrase felt familiar, as though he'd heard it long ago, maybe in one of his grandfather's stories from his army days. He approached the column and touched the metal. It vibrated faintly, the same rhythm as the hum that filled the air. Somewhere beneath him, something was still running, some mechanism alive after half a century. He scanned the room again and noticed a metal desk pushed against the wall, half submerged in the shallow water. Papers floated around it, the ink washed away long ago. Behind the desk hung a faded map pinned to the wall, its edges curled with moisture. The letters were barely legible, but he could make out part of a schematic showing tunnels and labeled zones. Section A, Section B, Section C. His location glowed faintly on the paper, outlined in red. Section C. The hum deepened for a moment, a low rumble that made the walls tremble slightly. Jacob took a step back, alarmed. The vibration subsided, but a fine drizzle of dust fell from the ceiling. He looked up and saw a fracture spreading slowly across the concrete. The place was giving way, the structure losing whatever strength it had left. He knew he couldn't stay much longer. He turned toward the entrance, but before leaving, he took one last look at the column and the nameplate on it. Deep Soil Initiative. He whispered the words aloud, testing their sound, as though speaking them might unlock their meaning. He retraced his path carefully, marking the walls with chalk as he went. Each sound in the tunnel seemed magnified now, the dripping water, the creaking of pipes, even his own breathing. When he finally crawled back through the broken section of wall and reached the base of the sinkhole, he felt the first true wave of fear. The rope hung motionless above him, and the circle of light at the top looked impossibly far away. For a brief second he thought Marcus might have left, but then a shout echoed faintly down. "You good?" "Pull me up," Jacob yelled, gripping the line. The rope went taut, and slowly he began to ascend. The climb felt endless. His arms burned, and twice the soil near the edge gave way, sending loose gravel tumbling past him. But eventually, a hand reached down, Marcus's, and pulled him over the rim. Jacob collapsed onto the grass, breathing hard. His clothes were streaked with mud, and the smell of rust and oil clung to him. Carla came running from the porch, her voice shaking. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, still catching his breath. "No, but there's something down there. A tunnel, old concrete walls, machinery, signs with government markings." Marcus frowned. "You serious?" Jacob looked up at him, his eyes distant. "Dead serious. And whatever it is, it's still running." The three of them stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the dark hole. The afternoon sun glinted off the moist earth, and for a moment Jacob thought he saw the faintest shimmer of light moving deep within, like something breathing in the dark. He turned to Carla, who looked pale and exhausted. "I think I found something we were never supposed to find," he said quietly. That night, as the wind picked up again and the sky glowed faintly orange in the distance, Jacob sat alone by the window, staring out at the black shape of the sinkhole. The sound of the hum was gone now, or maybe he just couldn't hear it from here. But in his mind, it still pulsed, faint and insistent, as though calling him back. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the hole was more than a collapse, more than an accident of weather. It was an opening into the past, into a secret that had been buried under his land long before he was born. And now that he had seen it, he understood there would be no peace until he uncovered the rest. The storm had awakened something ancient beneath Monroe County, and Jacob Wilson, whether he liked it or not, had just stepped into its heart. The following morning arrived gray and still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The sinkhole lay quiet again, though Jacob could not shake the sense that it was only pretending to sleep. He had barely spoken through breakfast, his mind returning again and again to the words he'd seen in the tunnel. Deep Soil Initiative. The name carried weight, a kind of official menace. Carla watched him from across the table, her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. She didn't ask what he had found. She already knew it was something he couldn't explain without sounding insane. He left the house before sunrise, walking across the damp grass to the place where the ground had opened. The edges were beginning to harden, forming jagged shelves of dried mud. The morning mist clung to everything, turning the air metallic. When he crouched and looked down, he saw no sign of the corridor he'd entered the day before. It was hidden now beneath shadows. Yet the memory of those rusted walls, the sealed chambers, and the faint vibration beneath his boots still haunted him. Jacob couldn't get the phrase Deep Soil Initiative out of his mind. The lettering had been official, stenciled like something from the military. His grandfather, Samuel Wilson, had served in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers during the 1950s. Jacob remembered hearing stories as a boy, vague recollections about ground projects, test drills, and federal soil studies. At the time, they had sounded dull, the way old men talked about work no one understood. Now, decades later, it seemed the past had literally surfaced under his feet. He went to the attic after lunch, climbing the narrow wooden stairs that creaked beneath his weight. Dust swirled in the air like thin smoke, catching in the beams of light that filtered through the small circular window. The smell of cedar and thyme filled the space. He rummaged through old boxes, opening one marked S. Wilson Personal. Inside were tools, medals, faded photographs, and bundles of yellowed papers tied with twine. He unwrapped them carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. There were photographs of men in uniform standing near concrete structures half buried in dirt, the kind of utilitarian construction that could be anything: bunkers, storage silos, test sites. One photo in particular caught his eye. It showed a group of men beside a freshly poured concrete wall with the same type of lettering he had seen underground. Section C. Standing near the middle of the group in his work uniform and hat was his grandfather. On the back of the photo, written in pencil in his grandfather's steady handwriting, were the words, October 1957. "Keep quiet, Sam." Jacob sat there for a long time, the photo trembling between his fingers. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice now, low and measured, warning him never to dig too deep, never to disturb what was buried. He'd always thought it was a metaphor for family secrets, not a literal command. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth, he found an old letter addressed to Samuel Wilson from the U.S. Army Engineering Division. The paper was brittle, the ink slightly faded, but the words were legible. "Thank you for your continued service on Project DSI. As per federal directive, this correspondence is to remain confidential. All materials pertaining to the Deep Soil Initiative are to be sealed at the completion of construction and are not to be discussed with non-cleared personnel." It was dated 1958. Jacob leaned back against the beams of the attic and exhaled. He felt as if he had just uncovered a grave. His grandfather had helped build whatever was under that hole, and now, decades later, it was breaking apart. When he went back downstairs, Carla met him at the base of the stairs. "You found something, didn't you?" she asked quietly. He nodded, showing her the letter and the photograph. She read them slowly, her brow furrowing. "Project DSI," she murmured. "What does that even mean?" "I think it means our land used to be part of a military testing zone," he said, "and whatever they buried down there, they didn't expect it to wake up again." Carla's hand went to her mouth. "Jacob, if this is government property, if they built something under here, maybe we shouldn't—" He interrupted her gently. "If the ground keeps sinking, it won't just take our house. It'll take half the street. Someone has to know what they left down there." That afternoon, he drove to the county records office in town, hoping to find some trace of land deeds or construction permits that might explain the structure. The clerk, an older woman with horn-rimmed glasses, searched through the archives. "Nothing here shows any government projects on your parcel," she said after some time. "The only notation is an ownership transfer from your grandfather to your father in 1969. "Are there older records? Maybe something from the 50s? He asked. She frowned. "There was a fire in 74. Most of the paper records from before that year are gone." She lowered her voice slightly. "You're not the first to ask, though. People around here still talk about the old board tests they ran out in the fields back in the day. My father said they brought in trucks at night. Didn't tell anyone what they were doing." Jacob thanked her and left. As he drove back home, the afternoon light shifted, turning the highway into a ribbon of gold and shadow. The wind moved through the tall grass along the roadside like a whisper. He thought about what the clerk had said. Trucks at night, secret operations. It fit with the letter and the photos. His grandfather had been part of something larger, something sealed and forgotten. Back home, he spread everything on the kitchen table. The photographs, the letter, the documents he had managed to copy from the courthouse. Carla stood beside him, arms crossed. The children were in their rooms, mercifully unaware. Jacob traced a finger over the map in one of the photos, noting the faint outlines of what looked like a grid of tunnels. "If this was Section C," he said, pointing to the marking, "then there had to be at least Sections A and B." "You think it's all connected?" she asked. "I think it's more than just our property," he said quietly. "And if the ground gave way here, there's no telling where else it might happen." That night, Jacob sat alone on the porch again. The air was cooler now, scented with pine and distant rain. The sky was clear and stars shimmered faintly above the black silhouette of the trees. He held the photo of his grandfather in his hand, the one with the inscription. The old man's face was serious, almost solemn, as if he'd known the weight of what they were burying. He remembered something else, an old family gathering when he was a child. His grandfather had gotten drunk and told a story about a machine that could feel the earth breathe. At the time, everyone laughed, thinking it was just an old soldier's rambling. But now Jacob wondered if that machine was real, buried somewhere beneath them, still humming after all these years. He went back inside, pulled an old lockbox from under his bed and opened it. Inside was a smaller box, his grandfather's service chest. Inside were medals, a folded flag, and a small leather-bound notebook. Jacob had seen it before, but had never read it out of respect. Tonight he opened it. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about weather, crop conditions, and family matters. But one page, dated November 2nd, 1957, caught his eye. It read, "They told us it was just soil containment, but the pressure gauges don't lie. We buried more than we should have. I signed the papers. Lord forgive me. If this ground ever opens again, God help whoever's living here." Jacob's hands trembled as he closed the book. It was no longer a theory. His grandfather had known what was beneath them, and he had been afraid of it. He spent the rest of the night sitting at the table, the documents spread around him like puzzle pieces. When the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, it illuminated the photograph of Samuel Wilson standing proudly in front of Section C. The inked words, "Keep quiet," seemed to darken with the sunlight. Jacob stared at them until his eyes blurred. The house was still asleep when he finally stood. He walked to the window and looked out toward the sinkhole, its black mouth barely visible in the mist. Somewhere below that hole lay the remnants of his grandfather's work, and perhaps the reason the earth had decided to break open now. He knew then that he couldn't stop. He would have to go back down. not for curiosity's sake, but for truth. The truth had waited nearly 70 years under the soil. It wasn't going to rest quietly anymore. And as Jacob turned from the window, the hum returned, not faint, not imagined, but steady and real, echoing through the floorboards of the house, as though the ground itself was reminding him that secrets never stay buried forever. The following day dawned under a low, brooding sky, the air heavy and colorless. The humidity made the ground slick, and the faint smell of metal still lingered near the sinkhole, as if the storm had never truly left. Jacob stood by the edge again, gripping a folded photograph of his grandfather in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The image of Samuel Wilson staring proudly beside the concrete wall marked Section C haunted him, a silent accusation from the past. It no longer felt like a discovery. It felt like an inheritance, one he hadn't asked for. By noon, a few neighbors had wandered over, drawn by the rumors that had already begun to circulate around town. Word had spread that Jacob had gone down into the pit, that he'd found tunnels and machinery, even that he'd uncovered government property. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear. They clustered near the roadside, whispering among themselves, unsure whether to believe him. Marcus arrived last, his truck throwing up a cloud of dust as it pulled to a stop. He stepped out, holding a small video camera and a coil of rope. "If we're going back down," he said, "we better do it right this time." Carla stood on the porch with her arms folded, watching the men prepare. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but also resignation. She had tried reasoning with Jacob the night before, begging him to call someone, to let the authorities handle it. But Jacob had already called, and the county office had given the same useless answer. Engineers were busy assessing storm damage in nearby towns, and it could take several days before anyone could inspect the site. He had heard the tone in the woman's voice, detached, procedural, like she was reading from a checklist. No one would come until it was too late. Marcus adjusted the straps of his harness. "You sure you want to do this again?" he asked. "That place looks like it's about to collapse." Jacob nodded. "That's exactly why we have to. If it keeps spreading, it'll reach the road next, maybe the gas line." Old Mr. Lawrence, who had come to watch, stepped closer. His lined face looked unusually grim. "Son, this land's got more history than most folks care to remember," he said. "When I was a boy, we used to see trucks come through at night. Government ones. They said they were testing soil composition for building foundations, but no one ever saw what they were really doing. You think this," he gestured to the sinkhole, "is just the ground given up after all these years?" Jacob met the old man's gaze. "I think this is something they buried coming back to the surface." Lawrence nodded slowly, as if that answer had been waiting decades to be spoken aloud. "Then I'm going with you," he said. Marcus gave him a startled look, but Lawrence only smiled faintly. "Don't worry, boy. I may be old, but I remember things you don't. If there's something down there worth finding, you'll want someone who knows where to look." The three men descended together. The earth groaned faintly under their weight, but the rope held. When Jacob's boots touched the bottom, the familiar scent of oil and rust rose to greet him. The air was thicker today, and the hum was stronger, vibrating through the soles of his feet. He led the way through the collapsed section of wall into the corridor, his flashlight cutting narrow slices through the darkness. The tunnel looked worse than before. Cracks veined the ceiling, and chunks of concrete had fallen to the floor. The shallow puddles from the last visit were now slick with a faint rainbow sheen, an oily residue that rippled whenever they stepped near. As they moved forward, Lawrence ran his hand along the wall, his fingers tracing the faded, stenciled letters. "See this texture?" he said. "That's not standard military mix. They reinforced it with some kind of chemical compound. We used to pour stuff like this when they needed containment. You don't use that for storage. You use it to keep something sealed." Jacob glanced at him. "Sealed from what?" Lawrence shrugged, but his eyes betrayed unease. "Could be anything, from volatile waste to gas pressure chambers. Back then, they didn't tell the laborers much, just paid them to pour and keep quiet." They reached the large circular chamber where Jacob had first seen the rusted pipes and valves. The column still stood in the center, silent except for the low rhythmic hum echoing through its base. But now, something else had changed. The floor had cracked open along one edge, revealing a black fissure beneath the shallow water. Marcus knelt beside it, shining his light downward. The beam disappeared almost instantly. "That's not just a crack," he said. "That's a shaft." Jacob crouched beside him and aimed his own flashlight into the gap. The smell rising from it was foul, sweet, chemical, and decayed, like a mix of old gasoline and rotten fruit. He felt a faint dizziness after inhaling and quickly pulled back. Lawrence sniffed the air, his expression tightening. "That's nitroglycerin residue," he muttered. "Haven't smelled that since the old mine days. Whatever's leaking down there, it's explosive." The word hung in the air like a verdict. Jacob looked around the chamber again, his heart pounding. The pressure gauges on the old pipes were quivering slightly, as if something deep below was moving. "If these tanks are leaking," he said quietly, "then the ground's not just sinking, it's destabilizing from the inside." They spent nearly an hour documenting everything. Marcus filmed the pipes, the fissure, the corrosion, and the markings. Lawrence pointed out faint labels on the wall that none of them had noticed before, arrows and numbers forming a rough pattern that seemed to lead deeper underground. Jacob followed them with the beam of his flashlight until the markings vanished into another collapsed corridor. "It's all connected," he murmured. "Section C might just be one part of a whole grid." When they finally climbed back out into the daylight, their clothes were damp and the metallic smell clung to their skin. Carla was waiting at the top, her expression shifting from relief to alarm when she saw their faces. "What happened?" she demanded. Jacob held up the camera. "We found something worse than just old concrete," he said. "There are chemicals down there, containers, and a gas buildup." Marcus added, "One of the cracks is still widening. If there's pressure building underground, it could spread." Lawrence rubbed his hands together slowly, his gaze drifting toward the distant houses. "You need to get the county out here tonight, not next week, not tomorrow." Jacob agreed. He went inside and called every number he could find. The local fire department, the environmental safety office, even the state emergency hotline. Each call was met with the same polite detachment. Officials promising to log the report and prioritize it for investigation. He tried explaining about the chemicals, the risk of explosion, the structural collapse, but the responses never changed. One operator even suggested he might be mistaken about the nature of the materials. By dusk, the frustration had hardened into anger. He stood on the porch, staring at the glowing windows of his neighbors' houses. They didn't know what was coming. None of them did. He had seen the fissures spreading under the street, creeping toward other properties. The ground under their entire community was rotten from within. That night, as the sky darkened and the crickets returned, the first tremor came. It was subtle at first, like the roll of distant thunder. The dishes on the kitchen shelf rattled. Carla froze mid-step, her eyes wide. "Was that another earthquake?" she whispered. Jacob didn't answer. He stepped outside just as the second tremor struck, stronger this time. A deep rumble echoed through the ground, and somewhere down the street a dog began to bark frantically. Then came the sound of splitting wood. The crack started at the far edge of the sinkhole and tore across the gravel driveway like a lightning bolt. Jacob shouted for Carla to get the children out of the house. He could hear neighbors shouting now, doors slamming, the whine of engines as people fled in their cars. The fisher reached the street and crossed toward the opposite side, ripping open a section of asphalt. It stopped just short of a neighbor's garage, leaving a jagged line that steamed faintly in the cool night air. The smell of gas was unmistakable. Within minutes, the street was crowded with frightened residents. Flashlights cut across the darkness as people pointed and argued about what to do. Someone shouted to call the fire department. Another said the phones weren't connecting. Jacob climbed onto the hood of his truck to get their attention. "Listen to me," he shouted over the noise. "This isn't from the quake. There's something under us, old storage tanks or pipes. If they rupture, it's not just the street that'll collapse." The crowd fell silent, faces turning toward him illuminated by the flicker of flashlights. "We've already called everyone we can," he continued. "They're not coming tonight. So we have to make sure no one gets near that hole. Keep your kids inside, stay away from the cracks. If you smell gas, leave your house." The authority in his voice surprised even him. For a moment, no one moved. Then Marcus stepped forward and nodded. "He's right. We need to block the street." The others began to follow, dragging sawhorses and garbage bins to mark off the danger zone. Someone brought reflective tape from a construction kit. Within half an hour, they had created a rough perimeter around the sinkhole. Jacob stood at the edge, breathing hard. The rumbling had stopped, but the ground still felt alive under his boots, a faint pulse running through it like a heartbeat. Lawrence came to stand beside him. "You see what I meant now?" the old man said softly. "They built something under us that was never meant to last this long. And when it breaks, we'll be the ones buried with it." Jacob didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the dark pit. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we go back down again. I need more proof, something they can't ignore." Lawrence nodded slowly, understanding the weight of those words. Carla, standing behind them with the children, said nothing. She knew her husband too well. Whatever had been set in motion beneath their land, Jacob was no longer just a farmer or a homeowner caught in the middle of it. He was part of the story now, bound to it by blood and by the sins of those who came before him. As the night deepened, the crowd dispersed. The flashing red lights of distant emergency vehicles glowed faintly against the horizon, too far to help. The air smelled of oil, wet dirt, and faint ozone. Jacob remained outside long after everyone else had gone to bed, standing guard beside the sinkhole. Every few minutes he thought he could hear it, the low hum again, deeper now, vibrating through the ground like something stirring in its sleep. He thought of his grandfather's words written in the old notebook. "If this ground ever opens again, God help whoever's living here." The earth had opened, and there was no help coming. Only him, and whatever courage was left to face what lay below. When dawn came, pale and colorless, the street was quiet again. The fisher across the road steamed faintly in the early light, and the hole seemed to breathe mist into the morning air. Jacob knew what had to be done. He would gather the neighbors again, show them the footage, the documents, the photos of the rusted valves, and he would tell them everything he had learned. The truth had been buried long enough. It was time to bring it to the surface, no matter what it cost. Morning came without warmth. A pale fog lingered over the road, seeping through the fences and hovering above the cracked asphalt like smoke from an invisible fire. The neighborhood was silent, but not peaceful. Every house seemed to lean toward the sinkhole as though drawn to it, yet terrified of what it might reveal. Jacob had barely slept. He sat at the kitchen table, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside him, the camera Marcus had used resting in front of him like a loaded weapon. The footage inside it, images of rusted tanks, leaking residue, the words Deep Soil Initiative stamped on steel, was his only defense now, his only proof. He knew that soon someone would try to take it from him. Carla entered the kitchen quietly, wrapping her robe tighter around herself. "You didn't come to bed?" she said. "I couldn't," Jacob replied. "The ground moved again around 2. I could feel it in the walls." She nodded faintly, glancing toward the window where the fog pressed against the glass. "What are you going to do?" "Tell the truth," he said, "and make sure people listen this time." He spent the next hour preparing. He charged the camera, transferred the footage to his laptop, and uploaded a copy to an online drive in case something happened to the device. Then he wrote down everything: dates, names, descriptions of what they found underground, the chemicals, the warnings, the connection to his grandfather. When Marcus arrived just after sunrise, Jacob was ready. "We're going public," he said. Marcus looked uneasy. "You sure about that? Once you post it, there's no going back. They'll come for it, whoever's responsible for that mess down there." "They already came once," Jacob said, remembering the distant, polite voices on the phone telling him to stay out of it. "This time, they'll have to answer in front of everyone." By noon, the video was live. Jacob's voice narrated over the footage as the camera panned across the underground chamber, the corroded tanks, the leaking residue glimmering in the flashlight beam. He described how the collapse had begun after the earthquake, how they had found evidence of buried military waste, and how the local authorities refused to respond. Within hours, the post spread beyond their county. Dozens of comments appeared, some supportive, others skeptical, a few warning him to take it down. That afternoon, 2 black SUVs appeared at the end of the street. They rolled slowly toward his house, their tinted windows reflecting the pale sun. Carla saw them first. "Jacob," she said, her voice low and tight, "there's someone outside." He stepped onto the porch just as the vehicles stopped by the curb. 4 men got out, dressed in dark suits without insignia. The leader, a man with neatly combed gray hair and mirrored sunglasses, approached with a measured calm that sent a chill through Jacob. "Mr. Wilson?" he asked in a tone that was almost friendly. "Yes," Jacob said, his hand tightening around the porch railing. "I'm Agent Dyer," the man said, though he never showed a badge. "We're here on behalf of the Department of Environmental Oversight. We understand you've been in contact with the hazardous materials on your property." Jacob forced a smile. "Hazardous materials? You mean the ones your people buried under my land 70 years ago?" The man's expression didn't change. "We'd like to discuss that inside, if you don't mind." "I do mind," Jacob said. "You can say whatever you came to say right here." A brief silence followed. The other men shifted slightly, their posture just tense enough to show that politeness was optional. Finally, Dyer sighed. "Mr. Wilson, I'm afraid you've misunderstood the nature of what you found. Those structures are part of an obsolete agricultural drainage system built during the Cold War. They pose no immediate danger. However, unauthorized entry is a violation of federal law. I strongly suggest you remove that video and allow professionals to assess the site." Jacob studied him, realizing the script was rehearsed. "So, that's the story now. A drainage system that hums like a generator and leaks chemicals you can smell from the road?" Dyer's lips twitched. "The internet can be a dangerous place for misinformation, Mr. Wilson. You've caused unnecessary concern. Take the video down, and we can ensure your property is properly inspected and compensated." Jacob's voice hardened. "You mean bought?" The man said nothing. The stillness between them was heavier than any threat. Behind him, Marcus appeared on the porch, holding his phone up, recording. Dyer noticed, and his expression changed. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "There are things best left buried." Then he turned and walked back to his car. The SUVs drove away, leaving only the faint odor of exhaust and unease. That night, Jacob's video had been viewed over 50,000 times. Local news stations began calling. Reporters from neighboring counties showed up asking for interviews. Some treated him like a whistleblower, others like a crank. One news crew arrived with lights and microphones, setting up by the sinkhole as the neighbors watched from behind fences. The attention made Jacob uncomfortable, but he kept his composure. "This isn't about me," he told the reporter. "It's about accountability. People deserve to know what's under their homes." By evening, the video was gone, deleted, not just from the social platform, but from every account and backup he had made. The online drive showed an error message. When he tried to re-upload the footage, the file was corrupted. Marcus swore it had worked an hour earlier. The only copy left was on the camera, which Jacob now locked in his truck. Then, as if to prove that none of it had been coincidence, the power went out across the neighborhood. The sudden darkness pressed in like a living thing. Carla lit candles while the children whispered questions she couldn't answer. Outside, the air vibrated faintly again, the hum returning, stronger now, rising from beneath the ground like a pulse. Jacob stepped onto the porch and listened. It wasn't imagination. The sound had deepened, resonating through the boards beneath his feet. Lawrence appeared from across the street, carrying a flashlight. "It's worse tonight," he said. "The fissure by the garage spread another 2 feet. The soil's hollowing out underneath." Jacob looked toward the sinkhole. A faint mist was rising from it again, illuminated by the moonlight. "It's the pressure building," he said. "Something's breaking down inside those tanks." "Then we need to warn the others," Lawrence said. "We will," Jacob replied, "but this time not just the neighbors." He spent the next hours drafting a detailed report, attaching the remaining images Marcus had saved on his phone, the old letters from his grandfather, and every document he'd found linking the land to the government project. He sent it to every journalist who had contacted him and to several independent environmental organizations. Then he sent a copy to the state governor's office with a subject line that read, "Immediate Public Safety Risk, Monroe County." By dawn, the phones began to ring again. Some journalists wanted verification. Others wanted exclusives. One voice, low and hurried, told him that the story was already being flagged for review by federal communication monitors. "You're kicking a hornet's nest," the caller warned before hanging up. When Jacob stepped outside, the morning sun was a weak, filtered glow through a sky heavy with haze. The sinkhole looked larger again. The edges had crumbled during the night, swallowing part of the fence. He felt a tremor under his boots, subtle but unmistakable. Marcus joined him, carrying a metal pole to mark the new perimeter. You feel that? He asked. Jacob nodded. It's spreading faster now. They worked in silence for a while, marking the ground until a noise from the street made them turn. More vehicles, this time official ones, trucks with county emblems and men in orange safety vests. But behind them came another set of SUVs, black and unmarked. Dyer was among them. He approached with a thin smile. We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Wilson. We're here to begin site containment. Jacob frowned. Containment? It's standard protocol, Dyer said smoothly. We'll need you and your family to vacate the property temporarily. There's a potential for structural instability. You mean you're going to seal it off, Jacob said. The man didn't deny it. For safety reasons, yes. This area will be classified as restricted until further notice. Marcus stepped forward. You can't just do that. Half the neighborhood's affected. Dyer's smile remained. We can, and we will. Our priority is public safety. He gestured toward the trucks. Workers began unloading metal barriers, positioning them along the street. Others set up portable lights and warning signs. Within an hour, the sinkhole was surrounded by fencing and yellow tape, and uniformed guards stood watch. Carla watched from the window, holding Lily close. They're not here to fix it, she whispered. They're here to hide it. Jacob's jaw tightened. Then we'll make sure everyone sees what they're hiding. That evening, despite the barriers, neighbors gathered again. They were angry now, demanding answers, shouting at the workers who ignored them. Lawrence tried to calm them, but tension hung thick in the air. Dyer appeared briefly, speaking to a few residents in low tones, promising compensation and temporary relocation if needed. It only made them angrier. Jacob stood apart, watching as the men in suits installed a new device near the hole. A thick metal plate connected to cables and sensors. When he asked what it was, one of the workers muttered, "Pressure seal." That confirmed what he already feared. The chemicals beneath were volatile, and they were trying to trap the buildup instead of neutralizing it. Late that night, when the street was finally quiet, Jacob saw lights moving near the hole. Flashlights, not work lamps. He went outside and crept closer, staying in the shadows. Two men in vests were lowering something into the pit, a small cylindrical object that blinked faintly red. He realized with a jolt it was an explosive charge. They weren't sealing the site. They were going to collapse it completely. He turned back toward the house, heart pounding. Inside, Carla looked up from the couch, sensing his fear. "What is it?" "They're going to blow it," he said. "They're going to bury everything." "What about the chemicals, the gas?" "They don't care. They just want it gone." He rushed to his desk, grabbed the remaining copies of the documents, and stuffed them into a waterproof bag. "Wake the kids," he said. "We're leaving now." Outside, the air trembled again. A faint rumble rolled through the ground, deeper than before. The mist over the sinkhole thickened, glowing faintly in the lights the workers had left behind. As they packed the car, Jacob looked back one last time. He knew they would detonate it before sunrise. The truth he had fought to expose would be buried again, this time under layers of earth and silence. But not completely. In his truck, hidden beneath the seat, was the camera, the one copy they hadn't found. And Jacob knew that as long as that footage existed, the story wasn't over. They could bury the hole, the machines, the chemicals, but not the memory of what had been unearthed. As they drove away from the house, the horizon behind them flickered once, then again. A dull roar rolled through the ground, followed by a distant collapse. The road trembled for a moment, then stilled. Carla turned to him, her face pale in the dashboard light. "It's done," she said. Jacob shook his head. No, it's just beginning. He looked in the rearview mirror at the dark plume rising into the air. Beneath it lay the secret his grandfather had helped bury and that he had uncovered. It wasn't just a story about a sinkhole anymore. It was about what happens when truth is forced underground for too long. Eventually, it finds a way back to the surface. And as long as he was alive, Jacob would make sure it did. The explosion came just before dawn, a muted roar that rolled across the fields and was swallowed by the mist. From miles away, it sounded like thunder, but those who lived on the street knew better. Windows rattled, car alarms went off, and for a brief moment, the ground seemed to exhale, releasing decades of buried pressure. When Jacob returned that morning, the site of the sinkhole was unrecognizable. The massive cavity had been filled in and covered with packed soil and gravel. Metal barriers surrounded it, and warning signs now declared the area restricted by federal order. His home looked smaller somehow, dwarfed by the cold geometry of the containment fencing that stretched halfway down the block. He stood at the edge of the tape, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The air reeked of diesel and scorched metal. The men in suits were gone, replaced by local contractors who worked in silence, pretending not to notice him. Marcus joined him a few minutes later, his face drawn and pale from sleeplessness. "They did it," he said quietly. "They really buried it." Jacob nodded. For now. He knew this wasn't the end. Explosions could hide evidence, but they couldn't erase the truth. The vibration that followed the detonation had shaken more than the ground. It had shaken the people who lived on it. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, confused and angry, demanding to know what had happened. Officials in Vest fed them the same lines about safety, soil stabilization, and infrastructure repairs. But the smell in the air told a different story. It wasn't just smoke or dust. It was a sharp tang of chemicals, the same odor Jacob had smelled deep underground. By midday, the street was crowded. Reporters who had caught wind of the story before the footage vanished were back again, setting up cameras near the barricade. Residents gathered in clusters, their voices rising with frustration. Old Mr. Lawrence stood beside Jacob, leaning on his cane. "You can hear it, can't you?" he said. Jacob listened. Beneath the hum of machinery and the chatter of reporters, there was a faint, rhythmic throb, like something beating beneath the earth. "It's still alive down there," the old man said. "Whatever they think they killed, it's still breathing." The government men didn't return that day, but their presence lingered. A white van with no markings was parked at the end of the road, its windows tinted. Every few hours, the contractors spoke into radios, waiting for instructions. No one answered questions. When Jacob tried to approach, a uniformed worker told him calmly but firmly that he was trespassing on a closed investigation site. The arrogance of it lit a fire inside him. This wasn't their land. It was his family's. Generations of Wilsons had lived here, worked here, built their lives on this soil, never knowing what secrets had been buried beneath their feet. That evening, Jacob called a meeting. He went door to door, speaking to his neighbors, people who had once kept to themselves but were now bound by shared fear. The tremors, the sinkhole, the explosion, they had all felt it. He told them to gather at his house after sunset. Some hesitated, wary of getting involved in something that smelled of government trouble, but most agreed. They were tired of being kept in the dark. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Jacob's living room filled with people. The lights flickered, powered by a small generator since the grid had become unreliable. Marcus stood by the door, keeping watch in case anyone unwanted showed up. Lawrence sat in the corner, his weathered face illuminated by the soft glow of a lantern. Carla moved quietly among the guests, handing out coffee and keeping the children upstairs. Jacob waited until everyone had settled before he began. "They think it's over," he said. "They think that if they throw dirt over it, we'll stop asking questions. But the ground's still moving. You've all felt it. You've smelled it. Whatever they buried, it's leaking into the soil, into our water." A woman named Teresa, who lived across the street, spoke up. "I called the water company this morning. They said everything's normal." "Of course they did," Jacob replied. "They're following the same script. I've seen the documents. My grandfather worked on this project, Deep Soil Initiative. It was supposed to be about construction testing, but it was a cover. They dumped chemicals here, sealed them in underground chambers, and walked away. 70 years later, those containers are breaking down." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded slowly, as if recognizing the truth they'd been afraid to name. Lawrence raised a hand. "I was there when they started it," he said. "Not on this street, but a few miles west. They paid good money to keep mouths shut. Back then, nobody asked questions. We thought it was about jobs, but the soil never grew right after they left. The wells tasted of metal." Jacob turned to the group. "We can't rely on them to fix it. They'll cover it up again and move on. We need to gather our own evidence, samples, photos, testimonies. If we stand together, they can't silence us all." A young man near the back spoke nervously. "You're talking about going against the government." "I'm talking about protecting our families," Jacob said. "If we do nothing, we'll be drinking poison by next year." The room fell quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a low rumble rolled across the ground, like the echo of something stirring far below. That night, they made their plan. Small groups would take turns monitoring the site, documenting any changes in the ground or the air. Marcus offered to set up hidden cameras near the fence. Teresa, who worked at a local lab, promised to test water samples discreetly. Lawrence said he still had old maps from the 1960s showing where the bore sites had been drilled. They would start there. Over the following days, their small act of defiance grew into something larger. News of the Monroe sinkhole cover-up spread across social media despite repeated attempts to suppress it. Independent journalists arrived, some camping overnight in their cars. Jacob became an unwilling leader, fielding calls from reporters and lawyers while trying to keep his family safe. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like the soil over the buried chambers. Each night, he lay awake, listening to the faint hum that never stopped, wondering how long the ground could hold. Then, one afternoon, the hum changed. It deepened into a groan that vibrated through the entire street. People ran out of their houses as the earth shifted beneath them. Cracks reappeared along the road, splitting the asphalt. A mailbox tilted sideways, half swallowed by the dirt. The air smelled of sulfur and oil. Jacob shouted for everyone to move back, herding them toward the open field beyond the fences. From there, they watched as a plume of dust rose from the newly filled pit. The ground pulsed once, like a heartbeat, and then went still. When the tremor ended, Dyer and his men returned, arriving in unmarked trucks within the hour. They claimed the quake was a settling incident, and that there was no danger. But this time, the crowd didn't disperse. People shouted questions, demanded explanations. Dyer tried to calm them, but his smooth tone only fueled their anger. "You said it was safe," someone yelled. "Why's the ground still moving?" another shouted. Dyer's patience cracked. "We have the situation under control," he barked, but his voice was drowned out by the chorus of voices rising against him. Jacob stepped forward, holding up one of the containers Teresa had retrieved from the water test. "You lied," he said. "The water's contaminated. We have proof." He threw the vial toward the barrier. It shattered, splattering a thin sheen of oily liquid across the dirt. Even from a distance, the chemical smell was unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the crowd. For the first time, Dyer's composure faltered. Reporters captured everything. Cameras clicked, microphones extended, questions flew. Dyer signaled his men to retreat to the vehicles. The crowd surged forward, blocking the trucks. "You're not leaving," Marcus shouted. "You're going to answer for this." Chaos erupted as the agents pushed their way through. One of them shoved Marcus aside, and Jacob lunged forward, grabbing the man's arm. For a tense moment, the two locked eyes, one filled with fury, the other with cold calculation. Then the agent pulled free, leaving Jacob with nothing but the echo of his own rage. That night, Monroe County made the news nationwide. Footage of the confrontation spread across television and the internet. Environmental groups issued statements calling for an independent investigation. The governor's office promised to review the allegations. For the first time, Jacob felt a flicker of hope. They had forced the story into the open, but victory was fragile. He knew the people they were fighting had deeper pockets and longer memories than any local community. As the days passed, the tension in the neighborhood grew unbearable. Officials cordoned off the entire block, claiming it was unsafe for habitation. Families packed their belongings, moving in with relatives or to temporary housing. Carla wanted to leave too, but Jacob couldn't. "If I walk away now, they win," he told her. "This isn't just about our home anymore." One evening, as he stood alone by the fence, Lawrence joined him, carrying a folded map. "You should see this," the old man said. He spread it out on the hood of Jacob's truck. Faded ink showed a series of dotted lines running beneath their street and extending toward the river. "These are the old bore tunnels," he said. "Section C connects to Section B near the water. If one goes, they all go." Jacob stared at the map, feeling the air leave his lungs. The contamination could spread far beyond their neighborhood, into the groundwater, the farms, maybe even the city downstream. "Then we have to stop it," he said. Lawrence gave him a weary smile. "You're starting to sound like your grandfather. He tried to warn them too." The words settled heavily in the air. Jacob looked out over the fenced field where the sinkhole had once gaped. The soil looked calm again, but he could feel the vibration beneath his boots, faint but steady, like the earth's slow, steady heartbeat. "If this ground opens again," his grandfather had written, "God help whoever's living here." Jacob tightened his grip on the fence. "Maybe God's not coming," he whispered. "Maybe it's up to us." Behind him, the neighborhood lights flickered again, dimming for a moment before returning. The hum from beneath the ground grew louder, rising like a warning. The people of Monroe County were finally awake, but time was running out. The earth had been patient for 70 years, and Jacob knew its patience was almost gone. The night after the meeting was long and sleepless. Jacob lay awake, listening to the groaning of the earth beneath his house. Each vibration felt closer now, heavier, like something clawing upward through layers of soil. The faint hum had deepened into a constant low pulse that seemed to travel through the walls and into his bones. Carla had taken the children to stay with her sister after the last tremor, leaving him alone in a house that no longer felt safe. He couldn't blame her. The smell of chemicals had returned, stronger than ever, seeping through the ground like poison gas. It clung to everything, the grass, the furniture, his skin. No one from the county had come back to inspect the site. The officials, the workers, even the black SUVs, all had vanished after the confrontation. What remained were the fences, the warning signs, and the silence. By morning, the air was thick with a gray haze that turned the sun into a pale disk. The neighbors, who hadn't left their homes yet, were packing now, their windows boarded, their cars loaded with boxes. Marcus stopped by just before noon, his face drawn and his clothes streaked with dirt. "The tremors are getting worse," he said. "The ground behind the Lawrence house sank almost a foot overnight. He says he's hearing gas hiss through the cracks in his yard." Jacob nodded. "It's spreading. The map was right. Section B connects under the whole block." Marcus hesitated. "You think there's still something active down there? Some kind of system?" "There has to be," Jacob said. "Whatever they built to contain the waste, it's failing. If the pressure keeps building, the next collapse won't stop at this street." He looked out toward the field where the sinkhole had once yawned. The ground was flat now, covered with gravel and clay, but a faint shimmer of heat rose from it despite the cool air. It wasn't over. It had never been over. The government might have buried the evidence, but they hadn't stopped the danger. They had only delayed it. That afternoon, Jacob walked the perimeter of the fenced area, inspecting each post and joint. Several had shifted slightly, tilting inward as if the earth beneath them was sliding away. He crouched and pressed his palm to the ground. It was warm again, unnaturally warm. He knew what it meant. The chemicals trapped below were reacting, feeding off pressure and heat, releasing gases that would eventually ignite. The entire system was a time bomb. He found Lawrence sitting on his porch, staring at the field with a haunted look. The old man had aged years in the last few days. "You can feel it, can't you?" Lawrence said, without turning his head. "The ground's alive. It's trying to breathe." Jacob sat beside him. "It's not alive," he said quietly. "It's dying, and it's taken us with it." Lawrence turned, his eyes glassy. "When I worked out there in '58, they said the chambers would last forever. Said they were reinforced, sealed airtight. But nothing built by man lasts forever. You can't bury poison and expect the earth to forgive you." Jacob looked at him. "Then help me fix it." The old man gave a weary smile. "You mean go back down?" "It's the only way," Jacob said. "If we can find the pressure valve or whatever's left of it, maybe we can stop it from blowing. The system was meant to vent gas somewhere. There has to be a manual shutoff. The map showed a junction beneath Section C. I saw it the first time I went down." Lawrence studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If we go, we don't come back up unless it's done." That night, they prepared in silence. Marcus brought tools, a crowbar, a coil of heavy rope, flashlights, and a small gas detector he borrowed from his workshop. Jacob packed food, water, and a portable air tank. The air near the field had grown toxic, carrying a metallic taste that burned the throat. A line of mist hugged the ground, faintly glowing under the moonlight. Just after midnight, they cut through the fence and made their way toward the center of the site. The gravel crunched beneath their boots, the sound muffled by the dense air. The heat radiating from the ground was stronger now, forcing sweat down their backs despite the cold night. When they reached the spot where the sinkhole had once been, Jacob stopped. "Here," he said. "This is where it started." They worked quickly, shoveling away the loose gravel until the compacted soil beneath began to give. The gas detector beeped softly, warning of methane and something else, something unidentifiable. "It's bad," Marcus said. "You sure about this?" Jacob didn't answer. He just kept digging. After an hour of grueling work, the ground gave way, revealing the faint outline of the old tunnel entrance, a collapsed seam of concrete. With Lawrence's help, he pried away the remaining debris until the opening was wide enough for a man to crawl through. Warm air rushed out, heavy and fetid, carrying the scent of rust and decay. Jacob turned on his flashlight and peered inside. The tunnel was the same as before, but wetter, darker, and half-flooded. The walls glistened with condensation. A soft vibration ran through the air like the deep resonance of an engine far below. He took a breath from the air tank, adjusted his harness, and crawled in. Marcus followed, then Lawrence. The descent was slower this time. The tunnel twisted downward, the air growing thicker with every step. They passed the chamber with the rusted column now leaning precariously to one side. Steam hissed from cracks in the floor and water dripped from the ceiling in steady streams. The hum was louder here, almost deafening. Lawrence pointed toward the far wall. "There," he said, shouting over the noise. "That's the main junction. The pressure system connects there." Jacob aimed his flashlight. A tangle of pipes disappeared into a reinforced concrete block. At its center was a metal wheel, the valve. It was covered in corrosion, the letters on its surface barely legible. Emergency ventilation release. Marcus cursed under his breath. "If we open that, it could flood the whole system." "If we don't," Jacob said, "the pressure will do it for us." He climbed over the debris toward the valve. The floor vibrated violently now, shaking loose chunks of concrete. He gripped the wheel and tried to turn it. It didn't budge. He strained harder, his muscles trembling until a sharp crack rang through the tunnel. A jet of gas hissed out from the pipe, spraying his arm with a burst of cold vapor. The smell was overwhelming. "Jacob, get back!" Marcus shouted, pulling him away. The hiss grew louder, the valve groaning as if something massive was forcing its way through. Lawrence grabbed a rusted wrench from the floor and jammed it against the wheel. "Help me!" he yelled. Together they heaved. The metal screeched, then finally gave. The wheel spun violently, releasing a thunderous roar of gas that tore through the chamber. The air went white with mist. For a moment, Jacob thought they had made a terrible mistake. But then the vibration changed, slowing, weakening, as if the pressure beneath the ground was finally releasing. The roar faded to a steady hiss. The tunnel stopped shaking. They stood there, panting, surrounded by the rhythmic drip of water and the faint echo of escaping gas. Lawrence leaned against the wall, his face pale but steady. "You did it," he said. "You let it breathe again." Jacob looked around. The pipes were still groaning, but the strain had lessened. "It's not over," he said. "We have to seal it after it vents, or it'll start again." Before they could move, a distant boom echoed through the tunnels, followed by another. Dust rained from the ceiling. Marcus looked up, eyes wide. "That's coming from the surface." "They're detonating the other sections," Jacob realized. "They're trying to collapse the grid." The walls began to crack. Water surged through the fissures, flooding the floor. The light flickered in the mist. "Go!" Jacob shouted. "Get out!" They ran. The tunnel behind them roared as concrete slabs crashed down. The water rose to their knees, then their waists. The exit ahead glowed faintly with moonlight, but it was closing fast as the ground shifted. Marcus reached it first, climbing up through the narrow opening. Lawrence followed, gasping for air. Jacob was last. The water reached his chest, pulling at his legs. He pushed forward, his lungs burning. When he finally grabbed the edge of the opening, a burst of hot air rushed past him as another explosion went off deeper in the tunnel. He felt the heat on his back, the force of the blast lifting him off his feet. Marcus and Lawrence grabbed his arms, dragging him out just as the ground collapsed behind him. They rolled onto the gravel, coughing, covered in mud. The sight was chaos. Plumes of smoke rose from new fissures, and the faint orange glow of fire flickered through cracks in the earth. The hum had stopped, replaced by a deep, hollow silence. The ground was still again, but not at peace. For a long time, none of them spoke. Then Marcus turned to Jacob. "You think it's done?" Jacob looked at the smoking field. "It's stopped for now," he said, "but what's down there won't stay buried forever. They'll rebuild, reseal, and pretend it never happened. And when it breaks again, someone else will have to crawl down there." Lawrence nodded slowly. "Maybe next time they'll listen." The three men stood, watching the horizon turn pale with the first light of dawn. The mist rose from the ground, curling around their feet like ghostly breath. Behind them, the fences were twisted and half buried, the warning signs torn and blackened. The neighborhood was gone, evacuated, condemned, and left to rot. Jacob felt the weight of it all pressing on him, the legacy of his grandfather, the silence of the earth, the knowledge that he had only delayed the inevitable. But he also felt something else: resolve. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small data drive that Marcus had managed to save from the camera. The evidence was still intact. The truth had survived. As the sun rose higher, Jacob turned away from the field and began to walk down the cracked road, the others following behind. The ground beneath him was still warm, still breathing faintly. But this time he didn't fear it. He had looked into the heart of what was buried and lived to see the dawn. The earth would remember, as it always did, and so would he. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. New, unbelievable true stories are coming soon. Click to watch the next one right now, and share this video so more people can uncover the secrets buried beneath ordinary lives.